I'm Mr. Ramsey, saving Western civilization, one student at a time.
Last lecture we were discussing the von Schlieffen plan, and I mentioned 3 reasons why the von Schlieffen plan did not work under Moltke the Younger. The first reason was that Russia mobilized a lot faster than the von Schlieffen plan had anticipated. The second reason was that Belgium was more fortified, and it was harder for the German military to go through, the German army to get through Belgium a lot quicker. And the third reason is the British landed in France a lot quicker than Moltke had anticipated. So those are the 3 reasons I told you last time. I want to give you one more and then focus on the first reason about Russia mobilization. So the fourth, I would argue, the fourth major reason why Moltke, or the von Schlieffen plan didn't work was because of the fact that Moltke had turned his troops in to face the French troops rather than actually swinging around as von Schlieffen had anticipated. The plan was to swing around Paris, but what happened was the French troops had moved in, and so Moltke thought he could annihilate them by cutting in too quickly and then surrounding the French forces, which caused a gap in his lines once he allowed his troops to do that. And once they had the gap, the British can run their forces through and actually destroy the German army. So Moltke actually fell into depression, and his subordinates had to run the operations for him once he realized he had a gap in his line. Anyway, that's not the most important thing. The important thing is the reason why we studied the Battle of Marne is because that is the reason why we had deadlock in the Western Front. And so you have trench warfare develop because of that deadlock for the next 4 years. And then let me focus one more thing about why the von Schlieffen plan failed, and that was because Russia mobilized quicker than Moltke or von Schlieffen had anticipated. And while they're invading the Western Front and the Eastern Front, the Russians are moving into Germany proper and East Prussia. Okay, so Moltke had to divert some of his forces from the Western Front to the Eastern Front because the Russians are invading. And the major battle in the Eastern Front that you need to know is called the Battle of Tannenberg. And what happens is, as the Russians are coming into Eastern Prussia, the Germans actually, once they get there, they surround the Russians and they annihilate his force. And for the next 4 years, the Russians are going to be losing battle after battle after battle, and it's going to be millions of men each year that the Russians lose. So that's on the Eastern Front. We're going to really pay attention more on the Western Front, but that's the Eastern Front in a nutshell. The Russians come in early, gets surrounded at the Battle of Tannenberg, and is destroyed. And from here on out, the Eastern Front, even though has trench warfare, it's a lot larger battlefield, and so there's more movement in the Eastern Front than the Western Front. The Western Front is stalemate, and because of this stalemate, for the next 4 years, you're going to see both sides, the Central Powers and the Allied powers, try to break that front. So I'll give you a couple examples. Let's focus on the Central Powers and Germany, how they try to break that front. So in 1914, you have the Battle of Marne, causes the deadlock. You have the trench warfare. You have no movement whatsoever. So in 1915, the Germans try to do 2 things to break that that stalemate. At the Battle of Ypres in 1915, the Germans introduce chlorine gas, and they start using poison gas to see if they can use that to break this stalemate. The problem with poison gas, it wasn't not reliable because sometimes when you launch the gas, it actually blow in your face. So that didn't work too well. And then the Germans decided to use submarine warfare, which they call U-boats, in 1915. And in May of 1915, they actually sink a passenger liner called the Lusitania, where there was 1,200 people on board that died and 128 Americans. And Woodrow Wilson basically gave an ultimatum to Germany. And so the Germans decide that unrestricted submarine warfare is not going to work. And the reason why they're going to unrestricted submarine warfare is because of what the Allies are doing, which I'll talk about in a moment. By the way, the reason why the Germans actually sunk the Lusitania, because they were arguing that there was actually contraband on the Lusitania, which means that war material. And historians later found out there actually was war material on the Lusitania. Okay, so that's in 1915. So you had the Battle of the Marne in 1914. In 1915, you had the Battle of Ypres, and you have the battle, well, the sinking of the Lusitania, how the Germans are going to break the stalemate. Then in 1916, the German Navy is bottled up in the Baltic Sea, and so they decided to do a breakthrough in 1916 to break the blockade that the British have done, and that fails at the Battle of Jutland. It was a stalemate, but the German Navy has to stay in port, so they can't get out, and so that doesn't help blocking the or does not stop the stalemate. Then in 1917, the Germans decide to send a revolutionary called Vladimir Lenin. They actually send a whole bunch of revolutionaries. Okay, so they send Vladimir Lenin in particular to Russia to overthrow Tsar Nicholas II, and we'll talk about that more later in another lecture. But those are the things that the Germans are trying to do, and we'll also talk about how they tried to get to reuse the unrestricted submarine warfare. So those are the things that they do, because in 1917 they send Vladimir Lenin over there, and also the Germans in 1917 is going to go back to unrestricted submarine warfare, which is going to draw the Americans into the war. Okay, so those are the things the Germans do to try to win the war, to break the stalemate. Let's talk about what the Allies try to do. Okay, so in 1914, after there's a stalemate, the Allies do a couple of things in 1914 and 1915. In 1914, the British Navy blockades the Germans. So there's no supplies getting in from Germany. They have to make their own supplies. And that includes all the Central Powers. Then, in 1915, the Allies tried to persuade Italy to enter the war. Okay? And they promised Italy, if you enter the war, we will give you the Dalmatian coast. So, in 1915, Italy joins the war. Then, in 1915 and at the beginning of 1916, Winston Churchill decides to have this grand plan called the Galava Campaign, which they're trying to take Constantinople so they could feed supplies to Russia, because the Central Powers the reason why they're called the Central Powers is because they're in Central of Europe and they're blocking any supplies that Russia can receive. So Winston Churchill has an idea, why don't we supply them? Okay, so his plan is called the Galava Campaign, and he's Admiralty of the Navy at the time of World War I. And so he decides that he'll bombard the Turkish coast, then the British troops will land there and take Constantinople and supply the Russians so they can continue on with the war. The problem is, though, the British Navy get there a month early, bombard the coastline, and the Turks, with German support, know they're coming and where they're coming. And so they basically set up machine gun shops when the British arrive, killing thousands of people. And that was a disaster. And that disaster is called the Galava Campaign. And that ended in January of 1916. So this is the reason why we had the stalemate. A couple other things I want to talk about, going back to the Battle of Marne. One thing I didn't tell you about is for the French to actually arrive at the Battle of Marne, they actually took taxi cabs to get there. So that was pretty interesting. So it was the first time they were using civilians' vehicles to actually get to a battlefield. So there's some other things that are interesting, but I'll have to talk to you more about that later when we talk about the Americans in the war, because I want to talk about the conditions of these battles, and I want to talk about how the high command, especially General Haig's and his subordinates, how they viewed these battles. So I'll talk about that more in the America War in my next lecture. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed.